welcome. Sweden is more than IKEA and Volvo. Well, it's also about young, new, smart companies in technology and telecom industries doing some very exciting stuff. Joining me here to find out what spurs them along is Enrico Deiaco, Department Director, Swedish Agency for Growth Policy Analysis, and also a think tank. Right. Enrico, thank you very much. So I know that there are some interesting things happening in Sweden. I know, for instance, in the world of gaming, there are some young companies which are doing some cool gaming stuff and so on. So how do, and whereas the traditional perception is that Sweden is all about big companies and the IKEAs and the or Scandinavian companies like Nokia and others. So what's changing?
What's changing? First, a little historical background. You're completely right. I mean, Sweden and its performance has been the large companies. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, we have deep economic crisis in Sweden. No, not everyone knows about that, but we had negative growth rates, for instance, and so forth. It has changed quite a lot. After 95, a lot of reforms have been actually initiated, everything from pensions to actually deregulation of markets. And that has shaped a new growth model, I would say, in Sweden. The large companies, they are still there, definitely, but they are working very closely with new businesses, and sometimes we call them knowledge business services. And that's where the dynamics actually is in Sweden. The large companies have outsourced, sometimes to India, a lot to Sweden, of course, and spun off a lot of new companies, and they are working very, very closely together. The gaming industry is separate, that's I think Sweden being high-tech interested, a lot of young nerds actually are raised by sitting in front of the computer, and that has created a cluster, particularly in Stockholm, which is quite interesting actually. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So tell us, what are the, as this transition took place, from old manufacturing, if one can call it manufacturing, to the young tech kind of entrepreneurs, is this directed, or were there the right preconditions which allowed the creation? Like in California, you would say, okay, you have the big universities, and that's really the hotbed of creativity and talent and so on.
I wouldn't say that in Sweden. I think the hotbed is the large companies and the way they have spun out companies. For instance, a friend of mine looked at different types of spin-offs, comparing from the large companies and the Swedish universities. And during a 10-year period, around 400 companies were spun out of universities, and around 5,000 companies from the large companies. Outsourcing, or good ideas, or what else. And these companies are extremely viable, actually. They are growing faster than the university companies. They are much more stable, and they are doing better, actually. So it's different compared to Stanford, actually.
Right. It's interesting. So, so you're saying that the large companies act literally like motherships who kind of spawn many small boats who all then learn to sail.
Yes, and learn to sail. Yes. Yeah. And then, in addition, of course, policies has been important also for these smaller companies. So the whole institutional setting was actually then molded to serve the large companies. But after the crisis in 95, there's a lot of new initiatives actually trying to put out policies that also serve the smaller and medium-sized companies. So, for instance, tax systems have been much more generous. For instance, large companies almost paid no tax at all, if I can say so. The burden was on the small and medium-sized and the private people, working in the large companies. That has changed. So there's a lot of these type of regulatory efforts that have actually stimulated this. And then second, we have had a long discussion in Sweden about the need for entrepreneurship. So let's say an engineer that goes out from a technical university, 25 years ago, they would go to a large company like Ericsson or ABB or whatever. Nowadays, that's not the mindset. They want to do, start their own business. combination of stimulus and a continuing discussion about the need of entrepreneurship had changed the landscape in Sweden.
And when did all these discussions happen, and how long did the
Well, I would say,
change?
During the crisis, we had in the early 90s, we had during a couple of days 500% interest rate because we couldn't defend our exchange rate. And that kind of sense of crisis and a lot of different types of reforms kind of paved the environment for all these things. I would say, start somewhere in 93 and then onwards.
And it's also interesting that a crisis caused some of these changes.
Yes.
I mean, India too, a crisis resulted in opening up the markets in the early 90s.
It's not the whole story, but
Yeah.
crisis can sometimes be good, definitely.
Yeah, right. A good note to end on. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for
okay,
speaking with us,
fine.
Enrico.
Thank you.